Hey everyone, before we get started, check out this quick promo from the Deconstruction Workers podcast.
The average cost of a 3-credit-hour university course in America is $1,782. You could pay that, or you could listen to the Deconstruction Workers podcast and get a semester's worth of college knowledge for free. Popular culture professors turn their academic knowledge towards all of your favorite movies, television shows, theater productions, and more, for free. The Deconstruction Workers podcast is available at thedeconstructionworkers.com or on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, Overcast, Podcast Addict, or wherever you get your podcast fix. Give us an hour and we'll make you smarter. Money back guarantee.
Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and I am joined by Katie Schaefer. Today we are talking about the 1997 miniseries, The Shining, and it is definitely a 90s TV miniseries. That is one thing we all know for sure here. Katie, how are you doing today, though?
I'm doing good. I watched this last night, so it was a long watch, I will say that.
Yeah, it runs about 4.5 hours, give or take a few minutes, and you can tell that they aired it in 2-hour blocks because each disc that I had, there were 3 of them. Each one was an hour and a half. And then the final one had 11 deleted scenes on it. And I was like, do I want to watch these? And because there were 11 of them, you're kind of always unsure how long that will take. But it probably would have added another 15 minutes or so to the miniseries if they had left them in, and most of them weren't certainly not worth keeping in. It wasn't one of those things where you watched them and you're like, oh, I kind of think that would have helped the story.
Oh, good. I would have been really questioning if they had somehow cut that because they left so much stuff in that did not need to be in there.
Yeah, you just had so much going on that you were kind of like, okay, can we speed things up a little? Because even, you know, Kubrick's Shining movie is about 2.5 hours, which is pretty long for a movie back then. So you're like, okay, we understand that you have to put certain things in, but to make this 2 hours longer, I was like, oh no, because The Shining is not one of King's longer books either. It's actually a relatively short one by his standards.
Yeah, definitely. And it was one of his third book. And this one, it's such a leisurely paced miniseries. And it's very annoying at some times because there's parts of it that work in the book that do not translate to TV. And it was just so unfortunate. There were scenes I watched and I was like, you didn't need this. This didn't add anything to the story.
I do want to talk a little about the cast and crew in this because the miniseries is directed by Mick Garris, who has done multiple Stephen King adaptations. A lot of stuff ends up being either direct to video or TV stuff, but he's still very familiar with King's work. So the fact that he was doing this, I think, made King feel like he was going to stick to the source material a lot more than Kubrick did. But in order to have this version, they actually had to get permission from Kubrick, I read, and King had to stop trashing Kubrick's version of it or something. So that was kind of funny. And then you have the cast. And apparently Gary Sinise was up for the role of Jack Torrance, but people kept turning it down because nobody wanted to be compared to Jack Nicholson. So it was Rebecca De Mornay who actually recommended Steven Weber for this, and he ultimately took the role. And it's not that he's a bad Jack Torrance. I think just the pacing of the character story was a little off, and you have people like Pat Hingle makes an appearance, and he was previously in Maximum Overdrive. You have cameos from Stephen King himself. Sam Raimi is a gas station attendant in this. And you just have these people who kind of pop in here and there. Even Mick Garris's wife, Cynthia, was the woman in 217. So you have these people who are probably familiar to you, especially if you're watching it today as opposed to in 1997. But it still fell short story-wise, I think. But overall, what did you think of the cast and crew for this?
I think the casting was pretty strong for a miniseries.
Yeah.
I mean, especially in the 90s. Like, I think Steven Weber does a decent job. Like, he's a good actor, and he reads the It audiobook, which I've listened to a stupid amount of times. So his voice is really familiar to me, but not his face. So he gives a very interesting performance, and I think the parts that lack are much more script-based rather than him-based. But that's totally to say that he's not Jack Nicholson. There's only one Jack Nicholson.
Yeah.
So you can't compare the two. And you just kind of have to give him the benefit of the doubt because Nicholson gives such a intense performance.
And back then, you didn't really have movie stars crossing over into TV or anything like you do a ton now. So it's really hard to compare a movie performance to a television performance too, just because I don't want to say it's necessarily they're different caliber of actors, but they kind of are, because it's like movies are the things that a lot of people aspire to be in, and TV shows, I don't want to say they're second rate, but they just don't get the same kind of budget that a movie does, because TV has to stretch out over an entire season and they're working at a much faster production speed usually. You know, they don't have the same timeline that movies do, and you have to tell a longer story over the time period that you're given, even with a miniseries like this. So there are so many moving parts to why I think this story just doesn't necessarily work as a TV miniseries and definitely fits a movie format better.
Yes. And I did want to say about Rebecca De Mornay, I think she gives the best performance in this entire thing. She feels real and not over the top or campy at any point. So she was the one, by the end of it, I was like, you got it. You captured Wendy, because I think if there's anything that's weak in the Kubrick Shining, it's his portrayal of Wendy. Not that, you know, what's her name?
Shelley Duvall.
Thank you. Not that Shelley Duvall gives a great performance, but it's a really tortured performance because of Kubrick's directing. Whereas this Wendy feels so much more like the Wendy in the book. She's strong, she's resilient, she refuses to let Jack overwhelm her, and she never gets, even when he's smashing her with the mallet, she never gets like shrieky and over the top. She's just, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to let you beat me. I'm going to save my son. And I think that is what really holds that miniseries together, because if everyone had been giving an over-the-top performance, it would have felt a lot worse.
And it's always hard when you're working with children, too. I think both actors who have played Danny really have a lot that they need to accomplish as far as their characters, and I think both do a perfectly fine job. It's really hard to, you know, fault a child for what they're given to work with and everything. So I think the combination of Wendy and Danny and sort of how they play off of each other works better than his relationship with Jack, just because you do see that he understands what is going on with Jack, and he knows how he gets when he starts to get angry and starts drinking again. So because Danny sort of already knows all of these things about his dad, it's like there's not necessarily as much of a connection between the two, because Danny already has all of this information, but his mother is still super protective of him. So it's a different kind of relationship with the two, and I think the way this story plays out shows more of that than I think the movie does in a way.
Yes, I think it's so long partially because it takes on telling a much more detailed and intricate story of what's going on, and it feels much more like a ghost story at times, whereas the Shining film is much more about like a man being driven insane, and that he's the scary aspect of it rather than the Overlook being the scary aspect of it. And I think that works much better with that longer runtime. Still too long.
Yes.
But they managed to give a lot more depth to the relationships that are going on here and talk pretty frankly, especially for a TV miniseries, about the abuse that Jack is handing out, about what his relationship is with alcohol and how his family has had to learn to deal with that. I think all of those factors make it interesting despite its long runtime and maybe not the best script.
Yeah, while it is more true to the book, and you notice little things like room 237 got changed back to room 217 because Kubrick was asked to change it by the hotel for whatever reason, which is funny because he wasn't actually filming at the Stanley Hotel, but this one actually filmed there and didn't have to change it. I was like, that kind of makes no sense, but maybe by 1997 they had capitalized on the whole Stephen King thing, because now if you take a look at the Stanley Hotel website, you can book room 217 and it's like a special rate because it's the Stephen King room.
Oh yeah, I've been there and I've taken the Stephen King tour.
Yeah.
So yes, they have capitalized on it now, and I'm sure that's why they were like, whatever, that's fine, more business for us.
Yeah, I think they realized maybe later on, or maybe it was under different management at this point, so they didn't mind as much, but it was just a fun little thing to notice, like, oh, they were able to change some of these things back, and I do want to give them some credit for following the story more closely. I think they just could have moved it along faster because there is something very interesting about that hotel. And like you said, you've been there. I haven't had the chance to go yet, but now that I live in Colorado, that's a thing that is more likely to happen. So I won't necessarily stay there, but just to go and see it in person. And, you know, the maze didn't play a part in this like it did in Kubrick's version. And I was a little disappointed that the story didn't really have Danny running through the maze. And you do see, you know, the animal hedges come to life. And it looks okay. It doesn't look fantastic, but it's 97, so I'm willing to forgive some of that because they did do a lot of practical work in this with the ghosts and just the makeup and the design, and it really all looked the part. So the story from a setting point of view, I think they kind of nailed that, because even though Jack is more closed off with the typewriter and everything in this, you still got a sense like, hey, this is my space. Don't bother me when I'm working.
Yes, I think the Kubrick film is, I think the biggest difference in the setting part of it anyway, is how theatrical the Kubrick film is. Like every room is giant and they're always made to feel very small, and that's done purposefully. But in this, like, it is very much, the hotel feels real.
More claustrophobic, too.
Yes, and having been there, like, it's totally worth going. It still looks pretty similar to what's in the movie, like the carpets and the wallpaper and all of that is still the same, and it looks so creepy, even in the broad daylight when I took the tour. So it's represented very well in this, and it feels much closer to the King book, because he wrote the book after staying at the hotel, so it very much kind of matches up with the experience you would have actually being there versus being in massive, crazy monstrosity that is the hotel in Kubrick's version.
Yeah, and obviously they weren't going around destroying the actual hotel during this, so part of it was a set,
right.
But they recreated it to look exactly like the inside of the hotel, I would imagine, because I don't think the hotel would approve of Steven Weber putting holes in the walls and destroying all the furniture. But I think from a story perspective, the part that was lacking the most for me was the pacing. You have a lot of shots where they're kind of just walking around, and you have Wendy especially kind of just going room to room, either looking for Danny or Jack sometimes, and you're like, okay, I get that you want to show off all this great looking stuff from the hotel and everything, but can we just like cut and get to the point? Because they did want it to feel more claustrophobic, but with the amount of time that people spend walking around this place and not being able to hear each other, they kind of lose that element.
Yes, you can tell that they really loved the look. They really wanted to show off the look, like you said, and that detracts from the movie by the end, especially when the walking around happens just pretty much constantly. And it's such an interesting place, but it all starts to feel the same after a while, and it loses its drive, and I just felt like I reached a point where I stopped it and looked at the time and was like, there are still 45 minutes left, and we are already at the point where Jack has lost his mind and is chasing them. How are we going to stretch this out this far? And it's mostly that, just kind of walking around looking at things. The pacing with Jack, that I think is the worst done, and it suffers. The film suffered, or the miniseries suffers the most because of how they pace Jack's losing his mind.
Yeah, and on the other hand, with the Kubrick film, you have it to where it's kind of like Jack is already losing his mind before he takes the job. And you can explain some of that, but I think this was trying to kind of put things back into perspective. Like, oh, he didn't really know the pull that this place had until after they got there and got settled in and realized that, okay, all these chairs are going to fly off of these tables in the middle of the night for no reason. And it's like very gradual at the beginning, and then it's like all of a sudden everything is really fast, and it's like, okay, make up your mind, please, because it felt like the whole middle section, all of a sudden there was just a turn in Jack, and yes, you could see it coming, but it also was like, okay, you needed to fix the pacing here because you had slow, 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 fast, 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 and nothing in between.
Yeah, there's this brief moment where it's like he's totally nuts and he's totally normal. Like there's just, and I think that's their attempt to slowly slide into it, and it just fails because he's really, really intense. And then the next scene, he'll be acting like totally normal dad. And it's like, what is going on here? Are you nuts or not? I don't get it. And it becomes so frustrating by the end because once he actually like slides into the role fully, it's like, okay, are we for serious here? Are we done? Maybe. Then I'm like kind of on tenterhooks throughout the rest of the movie. Like, is he really nuts yet? Because we need to reach that point in order for things to progress.
Exactly. And I know that in Kubrick's version, obviously, he created the Grady twins, and he did all of these other sort of flashy things in the movie that didn't exist here. And even just scenes like Danny riding his little bike down the hallway and, you know, kind of making his way through the hotel in Kubrick's version, it felt like that was something that I would have liked to see here, just because Danny was walking or running everywhere, and you didn't really get a sense that this ever felt like home for Danny, which you kind of get in Kubrick's version, like, oh, he's just going to go play in the halls and stuff. Instead, he just kept getting in trouble in this one, and Jack kept getting mad at him. And because I read the book so long ago at this point now, in comparison to, you know, how much I've consumed since then, it's hard for me to remember how much Kubrick did pull from the book, because he did some things that just made sense in my head that I was like, oh, wait, was this actually in the book? So do you recall if there was more of Danny sort of playing in the hallways and stuff in the book?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that.
Okay.
I think, because like in the book, the Danny is the one being terrorized, and he's the one the house wants, and that's very clear.
Yeah.
So he has a lot of those scenes of Danny exploring and playing around and trying to see what's going on with the house with the hotel without endangering himself, because he knows something is wrong from almost right away.
Yeah.
So
he felt less curious in this.
Yes, exactly. And because of that, I think it makes it feel like when you find out that the hotel actually wants Danny, it kind of feels a little off kilter with how they've been presenting the goals, because there's so much about Jack in this and so much about how easily seduced he is.
I was a little disappointed by the croquet mallet too, just because it wasn't as menacing as the axe. And you kind of get this sense like, okay, you know, sure, he can technically kill someone with a mallet, but it's going to be a lot harder and take a lot more effort than an axe would.
Right. And I think that's from the book.
Yeah.
I think he gets a mallet in the book. It does feel less menacing and a little more like, and this is probably because of the character of the Joker and him carrying a mallet pretty regularly, but it feels kind of cartoonish when he's brandishing it about, because it's not an axe. axe or something more deadly.
And it doesn't look as pretty as Harley Quinn's mallet, so it's just not as exciting.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking, okay, you either need to make this bigger or different, because bigger would be a little more scary, but it's just small enough that, I mean, when he's hitting Wendy with it, it's like, oh, okay, well, I see how she can still get up and walk around, when those kind of blows should be like crushing. Like if somebody hits your knee with something like that, it should take that knee out for, you're going to have problems with it for life.
Yeah, I noticed a few funny things that happened throughout the miniseries too. Like, I believe it's when they're driving up the road to get to the hotel, something in the bottom right corner of the screen just like flies into view for a second and pops back down. And it wasn't necessarily a boom mic, because usually they're holding those above, but it's like some piece of equipment just got in the shot and then went away, and they just left it in. And then in the bar scene, when Jack has totally lost it, he's trying to kill Wendy and Danny, there's a moment where she hits him over the head with the unopened bottle of whiskey, and she starts sort of falling away to the right of the screen, and then it cuts, and all of a sudden she's sitting on a stool, and it was very abrupt, and I was just like, I can't unsee that now. And it's funny because with the TV miniseries in particular, I've noticed these things happening, and it's kind of clear to me that, oh, they didn't have, the continuity down just right to make these shots line up. And you can tell they probably did them on a different day, or it was a different take. And when stuff comes into view, it's like they just don't have the budget to redo that. But another thing I did notice too, it's a cameo I didn't mention earlier, but Shawnee Smith, who was Julie Lowry in The Stand, was also in this as the waitress in Miami, who kind of helps
That's
Dick
right.
when he gets, when he hears Danny calling for him. So that was just a nice little callback to The Stand as well. And apparently Miguel
Ferrer.
Yeah, it pops up in this, I believe, as Jack's father in a shot or something.
Oh, that's awesome. I missed the Ferrer, and I love Miguel Ferrer.
I did too. And I was like, wait, when did they kind of do a flashback to that? Because you hear Wendy talk about Jack's father.
Yes.
More than once in this, but I didn't recall a flashback. So I saw that like in the IMDb credits or something. And I was like, I don't remember that, but he is someone who was also in The Stand, and then he starred in The Night Flyer, which I just did an episode on that as well. So you have just these people who keep coming back to King properties for one reason or another. And it's kind of fun to catch those little things, because it's kind of like you're reading a Stephen King book where he makes all these little connections to other things.
Right, exactly. I love that about King's work. And I'm sure that will continue into, the forever of making King's movies. We'll just have new cycles of people who kind of are just like, hey, I'm here again.
Yeah, I know when you and I were texting while you were watching this after I had finished it, we were kind of like, oh, okay, wow, this is the thing that they did. And, sometimes you just have to kind of run with it when it comes to judging a TV miniseries and making your way through it, because you know that they don't have as big of a budget. It's not getting a theatrical release, and this aired on ABC. So it was definitely a big network event, as many of his TV movies and miniseries tend to be, and it really just felt very of the time, even though The Shining doesn't even take place in the 90s.
It does. And I saw they kind of tried to, because they definitely did not have the budget to make this like a period appropriate. So they just were like, oh, well, we'll just give him a Volkswagen and try to park as many old style cars around it as possible. But it's clear from like the scenes when they're on the highway and there's all these like new 90s cars driving past.
Yeah.
That it's like, wait, when is this set? What's happening here? So I thought that was, they tried. That was kind of how I felt about this movie, is they tried.
Yeah, and then you have Dick Halloran's car, which is very, very reminiscent of Christine.
Yes, it is.
It's just that bright red, and I don't even think it's a Plymouth Fury or anything. I think it's a Cadillac or something, but you just have this car in this color where you're like, oh, that is very much like Christine, even though it's a convertible and all. There are a lot of differences. It has like the different tail lights and everything. But when Danny blew out that tail light by thinking as hard as he did, it was just one of those things where you're like, oh, okay, I see what they did here with Dick Halloran's car. But you also get the sense that they put in a lot of things just for you to make those kind of connections, even if they weren't exact.
Right. They did the best they could, because one of the most expensive things to do is to set a movie in a previous period, because it requires so much set decoration and so much extra effort.
Yeah.
And they even go to Boulder a few times, but I think it works to call back for those people who've read the book. I think then it will work much better for those people. And I think if you haven't read the book, I think that might be a little confusing as to why is this guy driving like a 67 rusted out Volkswagen?
Yeah.
It doesn't fit in with the story.
And it barely makes it up the hill and everything. And
Yep.
It's funny because in the movie, it seems like they're all on their own. But then in this, all of a sudden, there's just a ton of people going up this same mountain right when everything's about to close.
Right? Right. And they get all mad at him. I'm like, that is not how it works in a mountain. People, having driven in Colorado, like, people do not drive like that there, because,
And you don't cross
you can
on a
die.
curve. You don't go around
Ever.
someone on a curve.
Ever. And that one was like an S curve. So I was like, there are 2 blind spots. You're all going to die.
And then you're a little disappointed when nothing happens.
Nope. Nothing happened. Because in a horror movie, like, that something would have happened. And I do want to give this movie credit. It does feel much more like a traditional horror movie that you would watch, like The Conjuring or something like that, than Kubrick's does. Kubrick's film is so very artistic and high-minded, and it's playing such a long game from the beginning that it's a very literary horror movie, if you will.
And I understand that it's not good as an adaptation following the source material directly. And as someone who is okay with adaptations taking sort of creative liberties here and there, that one is drastically different. And some of the most iconic Shining characters aren't even in the book. So it is a movie that made way bigger of a statement than I think this miniseries was ever going to be able to do. It's a very hard thing to follow up even decades later.
Yeah, it's one of the best movies by one of the best directors. Like, he is known for, 2001, Full Metal Jacket, The Shining, like, those are his, and Dr. Strangelove, those are his iconic pictures. And of course, somebody's going, what about this one? But we all love Kubrick, okay? So I think that it's impossible to follow this, and I'm kind of glad that they were like, well, we're going to go for a more direct adaptation of the book, because I do think that that story that's in the book that they try to adapt here is very interesting and has a lot to offer.
Yeah.
But Kubrick wasn't interested in any of that, because that's not how he made movies. He made his own work in his own way. And I know that, I think I read my copy of The Shining has a little intro by Stephen King.
Okay.
And he talks about how with this book, he decided to make the character of Jack Torrance complicated and not just make him this scary guy, and he felt that that was a point in his career where he stepped up as an author. So I think that that's kind of why he hates the Kubrick version so much, because Jack is pretty uncomplicated and pretty much just terrifying from the get-go. So I think that's kind of the crux of this, is he feels that, like, if someone watches that movie, it's not representative of the hard work he did creating this character, which is fine. It's not his movie. It's okay.
Yeah. What do you think of how they redirected the story in order to have Jack find out the history of the hotel?
In this one, you mean?
Yeah.
I think that worked, because I think that part of it in the book is integral to Jack becoming obsessed with the hotel. Mm-hmm. And there's a little bit too much of it, like with most of this movie.
Yeah.
But I think they probably could have condensed that to maybe 2 scenes, and there's a lot more than 2 scenes of it. But it works. I think it's a good idea, and it brings things together much more smoothly than them cutting it out and not having a way to really link Jack with the hotel as much as that does.
I agree with you that they used it a little too much because you have him going back to this room that has like a gate and you can't really tell if it's like in the attic or the basement or where it is, but it's just sort of dark and dingy. And that first scene where he finds like the scrapbook and drops it and the pages flip, I thought that was effective. But then we saw him back there multiple times, and then he was down by the fire and had sort of paper strewn about everywhere. And it really did feel like they were just trying to push the idea that Jack was obsessed with it a little too much, because you get a sense that he's already going downhill from there after that first encounter with the scrapbook. So they kind of played into it a little too much for my liking, but I think as a plot device, it worked pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's probably the core problem with a lot of this and why it's so long. They just kept reiterating the same things over and over again and didn't trust their audience to grasp what was going on in the behind the scenes. And I'm sure there was we need 4.5 hours material to fill these time slots. If you're going to make this is how long it has to be.
Yeah. And I will say that this is by no means unwatchable. You have certain adaptations where you're just like, oh my goodness, I never want to revisit that again. And while I might not revisit this anytime soon or maybe ever again, it's not because it was bad. It's just because there's a version I like better out there. And that sort of makes it hard to look at this, like I said earlier, without comparing it, because you got this version that people really loved. And sure, some people like King himself don't like it because it strayed from the source material. But as a horror movie, you can't really deny that it's a great horror movie. Is it a good adaptation? Maybe not, but it's a great horror movie nonetheless. And there are a lot of amazing things that Kubrick did with that version. And because this one is so straight-laced and just follows the book almost to the letter, you're kind of like, okay, but get creative a little with it. You know, there wasn't too much creativity, I think, in this one.
Yeah. Usually I've seen this, I think this was the third time I've watched this.
Okay.
Once when it came out years and years in 97. Once a couple of years ago after I read The Shining and was like, oh, I'd like to see this on the TV. And then once for this, for the podcast.
Yeah.
And it was, each time I got something different out of it, but I don't think I'll have to watch it again, maybe ever. I think I've had my fill of it because it just doesn't have enough to add, like you said, because it's just not very creative, and they didn't have the budget to do things like, you know, the elevator door opening and an entire hallway filling with blood and the Grady twins and all of those iconic moments. Like, there's nothing in here that you look at the shot and it makes you go, oh, that is scary, that is great. It's all just kind of as best as they could do.
We also got so many exterior shots of the hotel. I lost track of how many times we saw sort of the same view of the outside of the hotel.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God. It's tiring. It's like, okay, I know. Let's get back to the story. Keep it moving here.
Yeah, because it would like linger every single time too. And I'm like, okay, is someone outside? What's going on? We just showing you the hotel because it's amazing and pretty to look at.
Right. And the shots were so often from like an off-kilter angle, which is so 1990s. And it was just like, not every single one has to be this. I'm very critical of films and any TV shows, anything that reuses the same type of like really obvious shot, whether it's a crane shot or a split diopter or the off-kilter angle. Like, you should only use those once in a while because then it will have an effect. And they used it so often in this that it just feels blasé. Like, oh, yeah, creepy hotel.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be like that.
Well, do you have any final thoughts, a rating for this? Anything else you want to say?
I'm looking at my notes because this movie watching it irritated me so much. I was like, I have to write down things. I got to remember this much. Oh, the ending. We got to talk about the ending.
Okay. What do you want to say about it?
So cheesy, so bad. Oh my God. And that, like, I'm talking about the ending after, like, Danny has grown up and they show him graduating high school and, like, him seeing Jack and all of that, like, the tears and the kissing line, just all of it. I was like, this is terrible.
I was wondering if they were going to do like the epilogue thing in this, because in the book, we know that they move on, they go to Maine. Dick is a cook somewhere and kind of gets them set up and makes sure they're taken care of from that point on. But as soon as the explosion happened and I realized there was still more time left, I was like, uh-oh.
Yes, exactly. I was like, oh no, what's going to happen? And that they had to hammer home that, Tony is older Danny. It was just, oh God, it was so bad. I thought, oh, King, because he did the teleplay for this. Yeah. So it's like, oh, this is not one of your good endings. And the ending for the book works. Mm-hmm. I don't think this one does at all.
Yeah, it was definitely a little bizarre. And it's like, okay, what was the purpose of turning Danny into Tony? And like, what's going on here?
I mean, they say that in the book, but it's given one line. And it's the line when they're at the doctor's office. And in the miniseries, they talk about it being his stuffed tiger, but his middle name is Anthony. And the doctor brings that up. And they're like, oh, Tony is older Danny. But it's just given, like I said, like a couple lines. So it's an interesting factoid instead of like this apparently incredibly meaningful thing that it is in this miniseries.
Yeah.
But it's never really explained why that's meaningful. So it just feels like cheap.
It's a little confusing too, because they don't really give you that info early on. Like you said, they mention it at the doctor's office, but it's so easy to gloss over that. It would have been more effective maybe if when one of them called for Danny, or even with Jack getting mad at Danny all the time, using his middle name. Because I don't know about you, but that feels like a thing parents do. Like when they're really mad at you, they use your middle name.
Yeah, I do that with my kid. But yes, exactly. There's a way they could have done it in 1 second.
Yeah.
And it would have been much more affecting. So I think they just really didn't trust their audience. That's kind of my thoughts again, is they just like, we have to make sure they understand what's going on. No subtlety.
Yeah. Well, that ending aside, what did you ultimately end up rating this?
Like a 2 out of 5, I would say.
Okay.
It's just...
I gave it a 2.5, so we're kind of along the same lines. And I was on the verge of 2.5, and I was like, it was fine. It was very middle of the road for me.
Yep, exactly. And most of that rating is Rebecca De Mornay and how great the hotel looks.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, it looks really good, and she's doing her best.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Katie, thank you so much for coming on to talk about the Shining miniseries. I'm sorry I made you watch it for a third time.
No, it's good. And now I can check it off my list of ever having to watch it again.
Well, that's a plus at least.
Definitely.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.